the start of it all, the launch of Sputnik, the dawn of the great space race. Space exploration has been a dream in the eyes of previous humans and civilizations for hundreds of years. Though mankind has been going through trial and error to achieve such goal, the space age was the most memorable event to achieve so. The US space race between the Soviet Union was based on impulsive reactions and pressure and efforts to win and uphold a greater title of space exploration. NASA's development began after the launch of Sputnik. It had awakened Americans to achieve space exploration to become supreme and uphold the title of world leader. The thought of Russia upholding nuclear weapons in space, ready for attack on the US, was feared. The competition between both parties was a way to express pride in both countries during the Cold War and became a separate contest or an outlet to express it. On February 6, 1958, a Senate Special Committee on Space and Aeronautics was founded by Lyndon B. Johnson. The goal was to establish an agency for space. Many weren't sure if the space agency should be completely new or built upon an already open space research facility, or if it should be part of the military agency. During this time, President Eisenhower asked science advisor James R. Killian Jr. to assemble the PSAC, also known as Presidential Science Advisory Committee, that moved up into the White House as opposed to the former SAC. Eisenhower later approved a memorandum on March 5th that said that the new space agency will be formed around NACA. NACA, or National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, was established in 1915 on March 3rd. Their main focus was aviation. After the approved memorandum, legislation was drafted. Among those who drafted it was Willis H. Shapley and Paul G. Demling. These people soon later became important officials of NASA. This legislation stated that the space agency should be newly formed and not to be strengthened from one already established. Eisenhower established a National Aeronautics and Space Agency on April 2nd. Eileen Galloway, also known as the Great Dame of Space, is credited to reform the words from agency to administration as an establishment of power when coordinating with other agencies. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed on July 29, 1958, National Aeronautics and Space Act into law. On October 1958, NASA opened for business. Project Vanguard was chosen to be the first satellite to orbit Earth on September 9, 1955. It was operated by the Naval Research Laboratory. This supported the International Geophysical Year for the study of Earth science, until Sputnik 1 launched on October 4, 1957. This marked the beginning of the space age, and it was the first ever artificial satellite to orbit Earth.
Its casing opened, the springs snapped, and the nose cone was pushed out of the way. Humanity had entered the space age.
The United States scrambled to launch the satellite as soon as possible. Since the launch, many assumed the US had a huge technological gap between the Russians. Later on, January 31, 1958, Explorer 1 launched after the failure of Vanguard TV3, being called Kaputnik, Steputnik, and Flopnik, and it becomes the first US satellite launched. It was roughly 80 inches long and 6.25 centimeters wide. It orbited Earth 12.54 times a day. Credited to the success of the launch were three men: Dr. William H. Pickering, Dr. James A. Van Allen, and Dr. Wernher von Braun. This led to the discovery of the Van Allen radiation belts after low cosmic ray counts occurred, and the theory of radiation being trapped by Earth's magnetic field, causing the instruments on board to be saturated. This later being proven true. NASA continued to test with satellites, but aimed bigger and better as the space race continued for superiority. Russia sent several more aircrafts into orbit, including Luna 1 on January 4, 1959. The Russians have seemingly accomplished more, including previous launch Sputnik 2 on November 3, 1957, with the first animal ever to orbit, a dog by the name of Laika. She would only survive 2 days in orbit, originally intended for 10, however her passing was intended because no technology was available to bring her back down. Americans nicknamed it Mutnik. Though Americans have launched animals before in the years of 1947 to 48, none were actually able to orbit, only making a suborbital launch. NASA announces the first 7 astronauts in April of 1959, and they are deemed as American heroes. They are the Mercury 7 for the Project Mercury mission. Later, Luna 2 launches on September of 1959, some say carefully planned, before political leader Nikita Khrushchev meets President Eisenhower with pride in their work. Many of Russian works were kept hidden unless they were successful. On May the same year, NASA launches monkeys into space and brought them back. They were retrieved in the Atlantic Ocean. They became the first living creatures to survive after a space flight. On 1961, news of a man first launched into space by the name of Yuri Gagarin arose. April 12th becomes a historic day for both the cosmonauts and the Soviets. Now America's works intensified, trying to follow in the footsteps of Russia's achievements. John Shorty Powers, a NASA public affairs officer, comments, "We're all asleep down here," following disappointment. The disappointment did not last long because on the date of May 5th, Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space, being part of the Mercury mission. There were only room for one in the vessel named Freedom 7. This 15-minute flight would project new goals for America. Not long after, on May 25th, President John F. Kennedy would announce the goal of landing on the moon before the end of the decade.
Achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space.
After the embarrassment of the Soviets reaching space before they did, they strived for something bigger and something they could achieve before them. John Glenn, on February 20th, 1962, becomes the first American to orbit Earth, orbiting about 3 times in Friendship 7. Russia follows behind in the following year with Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. This greatly opposed NASA because no females were employed as astronauts. Tereshkova was awarded as Hero of the Soviet Union. Alexei Leonov, a Russian cosmonaut, was the first man to achieve a spacewalk on March 18, 1965, and perform extravehicular activity outside of his spacecraft.
Впервые в истории осуществлен выход человека из корабля.
Americans soon followed after June of the same year during the Gemini project with the aim for the moon. With Gemini 4, Edward White II became the first American to perform a spacewalk. Along with several other Gemini missions came the accomplishments, like setting a record for endurance of 14 days with Gemini 7, and the first rendezvous, 2 spacecrafts meeting within a very close distance, by Gemini 6. Sergei Korolev soon passes, along with his strong political influence and space exploration drive in the year of 1966. In March, Gemini missions continue with number 8, with a malfunction of the thruster being stuck, forcing NASA to abort. The Americans weren't the only one with issues. The Soviet Union followed their Voskhod 2 mission aircraft, landed opposite of where it should be, leaving the astronaut Alexei Leonov and his partner stranded in a taiga, only to be rescued the day after. Later during that month, they launched Luna 10, the first unmanned probe to orbit the moon and retrieve information back down. America soon follows right after with Surveyor 1 landing on the moon. Tragedy strikes in the year of 1967 and the first deaths arrive in the station after 3 men inside an Apollo 1 capsule were killed: Gus Grisman, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The same day, President Lyndon Johnson sets up the Treaty on Principles governing the activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space, now known as the Outer Space Treaty, stating no territorial claims will be set on celestial bodies, no contamination, and use of it for peace. It was signed by the United Kingdom, United States, and the Russian Federation. In 1968, Apollo 8 achieved an orbit of the moon that was manned. Americans were getting closer and closer to achieve the goal John F. Kennedy had set. Apollo 10 acted as a rehearsal for the actual landing of the moon, with Thomas Stratford, John W. Young, and Eugene A. Cernan testing the lunar module and command module in 1969. As we all know, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first men to set foot on the moon with Apollo 11. This evoked a sense of national pride to America and the accomplishment of John F. Kennedy's goal. July 20th, 1969 marks a huge accomplishment to not only America but mankind.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Some say this marked the end of the space race, with America being the unofficial winner. Both couldn't have been possible without one another's work. Later in 1975, Apollo 17, the last Apollo mission, docked with Soviet Soyuz that symbolized teamwork for future plans for both parties and missions. The exploration had been accomplished fairly well from space to the exploration of humankind's hard work to achieve any goal. Encounters occurred of new historical events that marked space history. Exchange happened quite quickly during the space age of ideas between the US and the USSR trying to top each other off, to be superior, enough to conjure ideas reflecting off of one another. Without the launch of Sputnik, who knows where space and our relationship with it would be. We possibly couldn't have the accomplishment what Scott Kelly has done with 340 days in space testing for the trip to Mars. In reality, humanity has won the great space race.